Hi, you're watching Times Insight, the Times of India Insight, our weekly show in collaboration with Deutsche Welle. That will be your weekly frontline view of Europe's shifting politics, security, and global role. Now, joining me every week is Biresh Banerjee, and as usual, he's there today with us. And Biresh joins us from Berlin as we break down the biggest stories shaping the continent. And of course, today there's nothing else to talk about but Trump tariffs. And Trump tariffs are real. The blanket tariffs have put the world on at the edge, possibly, of a global trade war. The European Union has vowed a united response, and of course, China has threatened countermeasures, and so have other nations. Videsh, the Trump, has put the European Union in the worst category of America's trade partners, hitting the bloc with a 20% tariff on all imports. Of course, now this 27 nation bloc is in the same bin as China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. What what's the mood there?
Guess who's not in the bin? Russia, and we can talk about that in some
Absolutely.
time. But then the mood is the same across the world. Nobody's happy with this, and there have been a number of reactions. There is nobody who is viewing this at all positively, because there is no positivity to it. This is a challenge to globalization. This is a challenge to the notion of free trade, the notion of trade with the United States, which is the European Union's largest trade partner. It's the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. And therefore, the European Union is wondering where this is all coming from. This is not a surprise. There were enough warnings for it. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
want to sort of tell you, give you, for our viewers, a bit of an idea about the kind of responses that are coming. So you've had Emmanuel Macron, who's called this brutal and unfounded. The outgoing German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is talking about this being fundamentally wrong. The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is saying that this is going to be dire for millions of people, and they're all right. I mean, it is going to be dire for millions of people, not just here in Europe, but around the world.
But in Trump's head, somehow it makes sense. And he says, you're hitting me with X amount of tariff. I'm just hitting you back with it. So what's the rationale there? Because I know Europe thinks there's no rationale to it, but in Trump's head, what is Trump's rationale? Because he says that you are charging me 20%, so I'm going to charge you 20%. Uh, on the face of it, it looks absolutely fine, doesn't it?
I mean, if you look at global politics and global economics purely from the point of view of what are they doing and are we doing the same, in that view,
Yeah.
that appears to be the Trumpian view of things. It would potentially make sense to Donald Trump and to his other supporters. But here in Europe, the view is slightly different, because what they are struggling with understanding is an American president is undoing a system that America pushed for the most part, after the Second World War, and something that has generally worked across the board. What Europeans are struggling hard to understand as well is about this whole tariff. So let me give you one specific example. So the European Union, before these tariffs were announced, I mean, they are yet the rate for tariffs, for example, for cars. The European Union charges a 10% tariff on cars entering the European Union. The United States charges something like 2.4%. And I was
Hmm.
putting this point to an economist I was talking to on our podcast that we do, News Desk. We were talking to Inga Feschner from ING Bank in Germany. And I'm saying, well, if tariffs are meant to be protectionist to protect domestic industry, the German car industry and the European car industry is mature enough. So why do we have these tariffs? And she said, in that case, for example, if the Europeans are imposing 10%, and if the Americans were to say, okay, we'll increase 2.4% by 7.6% to 10% as well, you can sort of understand the rationale behind it. But that
Hmm.
is not what is happening. What you're having is a blanket 10% reciprocal tariff and a cumulative tariff for the European Union for 20%. So it is not even targeted. Therefore, the Europeans are having trouble on making economic sense of it. And it's not just the Europeans who are having trouble making economic
It's the
sense.
whole
Just
world.
today morning, DW News, the whole world, and I'm giving you an example from another far corner of the world. I'm talking about Lesotho, which has been charged 50% tariffs. Now, just for context sake, Lesotho is a country of about 2 million people. Its annual GDP is about $2 billion. And most of the exports are basically textiles and jeans, and they go to the United States. We were talking to the trade minister of Lesotho this morning on DW News, and he was saying this idea that we've been charged with 50%, meaning that because if these are half of what we are charging, meaning we're charging somewhere around 99%, that is factually incorrect. It is more in the region of 7.5% or something. So factually, it is incorrect. And so little Lesotho is trying to understand why it has been charged 50% tariff. It is one of the poorest nations, one of the poorer nations in the world, and they be charged 50% tariff. So economically, nobody's being able to understand the rationale because it is not a targeted tariff measure.
And I want to talk some more about that because the US trade barriers haven't been this high since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Am I right, Biresh? In fact,
Yeah,
in
you're
the
right,
aftermath,
and there's a reason for that. Yeah, and there's a reason for that because these tariffs that you had before the Great Depression contributed to the Great Depression. They were not the sole reason for it, they
hmm,
contributed to it. And therefore, the US seemed to have learned from it. And after World War II, you had a different system that was built up. But go on.
yeah, in the aftermath of these tariffs, when asked, about the entire global market is in a tizzy. The S&P index has had its sharpest fall in many years, and in the aftermath,
Mhm.
Trump told reporters that he thinks it's all going very well. Now, you think it's just bravado, or is there a method to what many are now referring to as Trump's madness?
We here in Europe, people are trying to understand what the logic is, and I think many people are giving up on trying to understand any logic. And therefore, what Europe is trying to do is, okay, what can we do? We cannot really understand the mind of Donald Trump. We can sort of get where he's coming from, but even that argument doesn't make any sense in terms of everybody being unfair to America, which is blatantly not true because American power in the world is derived from the way it trades with the world and also on the basis of the military relationships it has. And since January, all of those are being cast aside completely without any discussion or negotiation. So the Europeans, for example, I can tell you, are looking at, okay, so what can we do? We should look at what we can do, what we can control, and what they want to do. And this was there in the messaging from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is, okay, look, we can try and negotiate, we can be prepared, and we can try and negotiate. And therefore, you see, Europe has not yet announced any countermeasures, although countermeasures are ready. At least the first tranche of countermeasures are ready. Again, that is also in response to the earlier tariffs on steel and aluminum imports of
Aluminum.
25%. So the European Union prepared something on that, but did not announce them even then. It wants to leave room and make space for negotiation with the US government, and the European Trade Commissioner wants to do that with his counterparts in the US. When will that happen? And even if it does happen, will that lead to any changes? We don't know. But the Europeans would like to talk about it as opposed to respond unilaterally to another unilateral
So
discussion.
I'm just curious.
Escalation is not the order of the day.
Right. So I'm just curious and maybe playing the devil's advocate here. We all know that Trump responds to his ego being stroked. Uh, but we everyone knew that the tariffs were coming on April 2nd, just as the rest of EU. Why not have these conversations before? Why have them after?
But they wanted to have these conversations before. You had European leaders and you had European teams in DC trying to talk about it. The other thing is also that the Americans gave indications about some tariffs coming, but it wasn't clear what kind of tariffs we are looking at, what numbers we are
So
looking at.
what do you
The
talk about?
Europeans have been saying from day one that. Sorry,
I'm saying if you don't know
I missed
that
that
you
question.
know what is coming, what do you talk about?
Exactly. Exactly, because the Europeans have not been taken into confidence, and we've talked about this in relation to the Ukraine war, for example. It's a war that's happening on European soil, but the Europeans were not being consulted when it came to any talks with Russia, and they still aren't being consulted. So the Europeans are also trying to say, okay, we would like to talk to you, but then you need to talk to us, and that conversation doesn't seem to be happening, or it doesn't seem to be leading somewhere. So it's not like the Europeans were just sitting around waiting for these tariffs to come. They wanted to avoid them, and messaging was being given, and
Hmm.
messaging was being made. But again, it seemed that the US administration had different ideas on their mind. It now seems that they might even want this might be a negotiating tactic. But then again, that is also something that people are just guessing, because nobody in Washington has said, okay, now we want to open talks with people. That has not been said explicitly either.
All right. So it was not an act. We all know that the S&P index, it had the worst day in 5 years yesterday, where $2.5 trillion was wiped off the index, not by an act of God, but by an act of Trump. So, and many are saying that these tariffs are somehow Trump's way of um, sort of getting the global trade in line to his view of thinking. What would you say about that?
I mean, I can tell you what the Europeans are thinking, and the indications that we've got from Asia, because we've talked to economists in Asia as well. I think everybody acknowledges that, okay, we want to have a new way of trading. What is that way of trading going to be? No one knows, and we haven't heard anything from the United States to say, okay, this is how we would like the world to be trading. So that clarity is not there. If anything, there is uncertainty. And this is something that economists have told us, and I've been interviewing them as well, and they all say there is uncertainty. So what is it that replaces the current way of trading, which is like which is globalization, prosperity for everybody? Everybody trades, somebody makes something that is cost effective for them, sells to somebody else for whom it is not cost effective to make the same thing.
Hmm.
What replaces that? That conversation needs to be had. The Europeans, for example, over here are trying to look at this and go like, okay, and this is something that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said yesterday as well. And she said, I agree that we need to look at trade in the current times. And this, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, and this needs to fit in with the current times. So there is an acknowledgement of that. But she also said tariffs as the first and last resort are not the way to do it. There is no conversation that is happening. If you're talking about globalization, if you're talking about trading with more than 100 countries, should the first step be punitive tariffs, not even targeted tariffs, as I was trying to explain earlier? It's not even tariffs with a particular sector in mind for a particular country. It's just a blanket tariff. Is that the best way to do it? That's the message coming from the European Union. Therefore, they are again open to talks. Remember, the Europeans haven't announced any countermeasures as yet. Although just before we began this talk, I just saw that China has announced a 34% tariff
Yes.
on all U.S. imports. That has just happened.
Yes, that has just happened. So clearly, are we heading towards global trade wars? Because now, if China has started it, China has retaliated. Others will also start retaliating. So is that going to be how world trade is going to be
It's
governed
a
now? I mean, it's anybody's guess,
it's a
really.
it's a very good question, and this is something that we've been asking. Like I've been asking two economists. I've been talking to Inga Freshna. I've been talking to Trinh Nguyen from Natixis. She's based in Hong Kong. I've been asking about globalization. Is this the end of globalization? The general consensus as regards trade war. Let's deal with trade war first. The trade war happens if other countries respond in the same measure. I think it is
Hmm.
quite telling that most other countries haven't responded as yet with counter tariffs. The European Union has made clear, for example, that we have countermeasures in place and they will probably come into effect on the 14th of April. They could have come into effect earlier, but they're coming into effect on the 14th of April. Another tranche might take about another month. To prepare. That is something that Bernd Lange, the chair of the EU Parliament's International Trade Committee, told our correspondent Lucia Schulten in Brussels. So nobody has, with the exception of China, nobody has as yet announced countermeasures. So you're not yet in the condition of a trade war, but it could get to that. I think what will
Yes.
be crucial here, at least from the European point of view, is can there be negotiations and talks with on an equal footing with the U.S. administration? And if that happens, what is the result of that? How long does it take? Because remember, this is an administration seen from the European point of view that tends to backpedal on a number of things that
Not
are
just
announced. You saw that with
backpedal,
the
not just
tariffs on
backpedal,
Canada.
Biresh. Not just backpedal, Biresh. In fact, they've been talking in different voices. You speak to Trump, he says that these tariffs are so that you have a firmer negotiation hand. You had the upper hand in making deals and negotiations. But you speak to his top aides, and they will tell you that there's no going back on these tariffs. They're done and dusted. That's where they stop. So you also hearing different voices from Washington itself or from the Trump administration itself. Isn't that right?
Exactly. And therefore you find that the Europeans, particularly I can say from Europe, because you see this happening on a daily basis, they are very keen to actually physically be there and to just try and suss out what is going on. And therefore you've had a stream of leaders, a stream of representations going from Europe to the United States to figure out what is going on, to try and be face to face and talk. And I'm just, and I don't know, I mean, like at a purely human level, I don't know what else one can do. I mean, if there is a problem in a relationship and the other side is taking unilateral actions, the tempting thing to do is to impose countermeasures and to retaliate. But that hasn't happened. Instead, people are saying, okay, let's try and talk about this. Even Tiny Lesotho, the trade minister we were talking to, he was telling us this morning on DW News that we are going to send a delegation to the United States to try and talk to them. I mean, in this day
Mm,
and age, you don't really need to be physically in a place to try and decide something, but people are still trying to do
mm,
that, to try and
mm.
talk and to try and save the overall trade system in the world, or discuss what replaces it. But there has to be that negotiation, and so far we it doesn't appear that this is happening. And again, admittedly, it's just the next day. It's been just 2 days, nearly 2 days, since this announcement. I mean, so let's see. Who knows what the next 48 hours bring?
But there's a very curious question I have, and I'm going to put it to you. I don't know whether you can answer this. What does it really mean for the far right in Europe? The rise of the far right in they seemed unstoppable. They were everywhere. They were rising, and now these Trump now it's all right, for you to adopt a certain stance when it's happening away from you. Let's say in Ukraine or in the Middle East or whatever. But this is happening to your own people, as you yourself said that Ursula von der Leyen said that it's going to bring misery upon the people and people of Europe. And frankly, short-term outlook of the eurozone, obviously, because I was listening to economists talking about this in Europe, and they said that it's going to be dire, maybe even bring about recession in some places. I'm not talking about Europe necessarily here, but in other places. What exactly you know can be maybe the political fallout on the far right, on the rise of the far right in Europe? Because you've seen Melanie's response. She has been critical of this, but otherwise, it's not as vociferous as, let's say, a Macron or a Starmer.
But it is critical because everybody realizes that everybody's in the same boat here, whether you're left of center, right of center, far right or far left. It
Absolutely.
affects everybody. There is nobody in Europe who is standing up and saying this is a good thing. Thank God it's happened. So, so in a way, for the far right, to be specific with your question, like let's give you an example here from Germany. You remember Alice Weidel, yeah, from
Yeah,
the
yeah, absolutely.
it's from the AFD, the Alternative for
Yeah.
Germany. The same woman,
Mm.
for our viewers who do not remember, the same
Elon
politician who
Musk.
had this spaces conversation on X with Elon Musk, right? And
Mm.
Elon Musk was also part of the party conference saying, the AFD is the one that can save Germany. And the AFD did
Oh,
come second in the recently concluded German election. The leader of that party, the co-leader of that party, Alice Weidel, she said, quote, this is poison for free trade. Yeah. This is the same person who had aligned herself heavily with JD Vance and with the Trump administration. Everything they're doing is fantastic. She's saying this is poison for free trade. You talked about Giorgia Meloni. She's not calling this a catastrophe, but she is calling it bad because
yeah.
the economics of this is undeniable. So, in terms of the political move, if anything, for the far right, this is a wake up call to say that, look, they will be completely isolated if they say that this is a move that works for everybody, because it just doesn't. Nobody in Europe, you cannot sell this to the citizens of Europe, to the people who live in Europe, that this is good for you. Europe will try and find a way out of this, but no political leader will stand up now and say, this is good, because then that is the end of their politics. So in terms of the far right benefiting from this is just not going to happen, because people see that this is something that has been forced upon the European Union, and their leaders are trying to do what they can to try and push back against this. I mean, you see this in Canada, for example. Mark Carney of the Liberals, who's currently Prime Minister, who's also uh, 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 standing for prime ministership. He's basically he is performing the same role that he is fighting for. Support for him and his party has gone up ever since talk of these tariffs and all began, because they see that this is something that has been forced onto Canada. And before
Hmm.
these tariffs took place, and before the earlier tariffs on Canada took effect, you found that the opposition was faring far better in the polls, and that is changing. So I think people around the world are realizing that this is an external thing that is coming in somewhat of an unfair manner from the United States, and their leaders are doing what they can to try and fight this. Therefore, coming back to the original question of the far right in Europe, I think they see that they need to be with the mainstream, so to speak, and side with the opinion here, which is heavily against this US decision.
Absolutely. If it's happening somewhere far away, you can say what you want. But if it's happening to your own people, whose votes you're hoping to get in the next election, then you really can't do that. But you talked about the European governments pulling through, coming out of this, and being able to navigate this. Do you believe that they can push through with necessary fiscal stimulus and reforms by strengthening their domestic economies? Because the economies are also not in the best of shapes, really.
I mean, economies around the world are generally not in the best of shape, because around the world, everybody is trying to recover from the twin shocks of COVID, and particularly for Europe,
Sure.
the war
Yeah.
in Ukraine, which had an adverse impact on Europe. In terms of fiscal stimulus, I do not know if fiscal stimulus would be needed. I think it would depend very much on. What the outcome of any potential talks with the Trump administration are going to be, or it would also depend on negotiations on trade deals with other nations. And the reason I bring that up is basically because, for example, you had Antonio Costa, the leader of the European Council. He was talking about strengthening trade with the Mercosur bloc of nations in South America. He was talking about quickly closing free trade agreements with Mexico, or doing that with
Absolutely.
India, for
Yeah.
example. So it depends a lot on that. It is early days right now. There has not been much talk about fiscal stimulus as far as I have seen, in terms of, okay, we need to do this, because Europe ultimately is an export oriented economy, and they were trading with the United States, which is the largest importer in the world. And suddenly, overnight, that relationship has been called to doubt. I mean, I do not know how you replace that. It sounds similar. It has echoes to the conversation that we've had about NATO, right, Aditi? I mean, it's
Right.
like
In
an
fact,
80-year
that's what
relationship it's taken to
that is
build NATO,
exactly
and you
what I
suddenly
was going to
remove
come
it.
to next.
What's going to
That
happen?
is exact. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to come to next because, uh, this. Do you think is the final reminder to for Europe that the transatlantic relationship has changed and changed forever?
I think people are quite clear and quite aware that the transatlantic relationship has changed. Interestingly, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, was in
Yeah.
Europe yesterday at NATO. He was meeting the NATO chief Mark Rutte, and his message was, the United States stands with you. United States stands with NATO. Uh, I don't think anybody in Europe is going to say we don't want the United States, but there is a changed understanding of how the United States approaches the transatlantic relationship. And I think Europe, you're going to see, not just in matters of defense, but also in terms of globalization, in terms of free trade, Europe will push a lot more to try and trade with other countries, to try and form trade agreements with other countries. And therefore, countries like India and Mexico, for example, stand to benefit on this. I mean, I know that a free trade agreement with Europe is
Yeah.
something that India has been pushing for, and those
Yeah.
negotiations had stalled. Then they picked up again a couple of years later. So maybe this is what propels a free trade agreement between Europe and India, for example. But to answer your original question, I don't think anybody in Europe wants to do away with the United States. They would rather be with the United States, but they realize that, okay, credibility and trust have taken a hit. We need to have other backup plans. We need to have other partners that we trade with. And in terms of defense, for example, we need to be more responsible for our own security. Steps are already being taken to make all of that happen. So the coming few years are going to be interesting, because it will take a few years. You're talking about a bloc in Europe
Sure.
of 27 nations. And as Bernd Lange, again, I go back to him, the chair of the EU Parliament's International Trade Committee, told us, he said, in Europe, 27 nations sit down together and decide what they're going to do. It's a democracy. It is not a question of one man determining what an entire nation should do.
Right. And the blanket tariffs have, of course, put the world on the brink of a possible, and I'm saying a possible global trade war. Right now, it's just China which has retaliated with tariffs of its own, but other nations might be coming out with their own tariffs soon, and who knows what happens next. And Biresh, you're right, it will take possibly the next few years to sort of sort this out, figure this out. Maybe a new trade order in the world will develop. Who knows? And what shape it will take, that also we don't know at this point. So a lot of don't knows there, but one thing is for certain, that the transatlantic relationship is never going to be the same again from here on. But thank you so much for joining us, Biresh, and thanks for those insights. Thank you, viewers, for watching us and watching this conversation. This is a joint production between Deutsche Welle and the Times of India here in New Delhi.